This episode is one that I've been waiting for in the last couple of years already. If you want to become a better blind taster, Nick Jackson's book Beyond Flavour is a must-have in your library. Nick is a young British master of wine who studied theology in Cambridge and now lives in the sunny Florida, where he imports artisanal European wines, helps private wine collectors, and much more. In many ways, his approach to tasting is a rather unique, but most certainly a helpful one. But I'll let him explain the origin story and methodology of the tasting by structure approach. We talked about the major updates in the second edition of his book about minerality, sapidity, and the two texture situation. You hear his criteria for selecting recommended producers, his take on the Florida wine market, and of course how to understand varieties. It was a great experience to look behind the curtains and pick Nick's brain a bit on how to structure something that probably never meant to be structured, but rather enjoyed. If you like this episode, don't hesitate to buy the book under the link below if you haven't done already so. Oh, and rate the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts to help others finding this episode more easily. You can also find Nick and myself on Instagram via the usernames in the description, but now, please grab a glass and get inspired. Nick Jackson, master of wine and author of the Beyond Flavour books. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Marta. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
How did you end up basically in the wine world? Because you studied theology, right, at Cambridge, if my research is correct.
Yes, exactly. Yes. So it was when I was doing my PhD in theology at Cambridge that I first was exposed to wine. I just went to one session of the wine society, the student wine society, and it happened to be a very good session to go to. It was the Hospice de Beaune tasting with Anthony Hansen, and this was back in 2009. And I didn't know anything about wine at that point. I didn't know even really honestly why I signed up to go to that class, but that was it. In that one evening, I was just fascinated by what I was tasting, and I guess I never looked back after that. So I finished my PhD, and then I remember I handed in my PhD on Friday, and then on the next Monday I started working at Sotheby's Wine in London.
Theology, do you have anything to do with it nowadays, or did you kind of let it go?
I mean, apart from going to mass every Sunday, that's about it. But I think there's a lot of I think certainly understanding the rudiments of Catholic theology is actually very important for understanding the way that particularly winemakers in places like Southwest Germany, Austria, of course, Italy, still many parts of Spain and France, how they tick, how they think. This tie-in with not only with the history of vineyard ownership, plantings of vines in places like Burgundy, all done by the church originally, but also in terms of things like the vineyard year, the sort of cycle of the seasons. All this has long been associated with the church year. So I think having a sort of working awareness of the sort of the basics of Catholic thought has been very helpful to me. Yeah. Was exposed to wine. I just went to one session of the wine society, the student wine society, and it happened to be a very good session to go to. It was the Hospice de Beaune tasting with Anthony Hansen, and this was back in 2009. And I didn't know anything about wine at that point. I didn't know even really honestly why I signed up to go to that class, but that was it. In that one evening, I was just fascinated by what I was tasting, and I guess I never looked back after that. So I finished my PhD, and then I remember I handed in my PhD on Friday, and then on the next Monday I started working at Sotheby's Wine in London.
Mm-hmm. That's why you also start the second edition book with a Latin quotation.
Oh, no one ever asked me about that. But it's a kind of it's a kind of joke. It's a very famous quotation in Latin, but it's about being humble in the face of wine, and in the face of how much we can know. And we can talk about the difference between the first edition and the second edition of the book. But one thing I include in the foreword to the second edition is an attempt to justify or to explain what I'm trying to do with the book. And what I suggest is that the entire book can be considered a kind of proposal for a way of tasting, rather than offering a series of definitive answers about what wine tastes like. So it's a much more sort of tentative and suggestive project than I think many people register, which is fine. But that Latin tag is just a reminder that we have to be humble in the face of wine. There's no final word when it comes to this subject.
And if you already talked about this kind of humbleness, I think it's a blind tasting and tasting in general. It could be quite subjective, right? And how was maybe your first encounter with wine? Not only maybe this first tasting, but also maybe your first professional approach to blind tasting or tasting. Did you always have the same palate, or did you also notice that your palate have been evolving and maybe noticing different stuff, or maybe taste wines differently than in the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, it's constant evolution, isn't it? I mean, it's changed since I passed the MW exam. It's changed since I wrote the first edition of the book. That's why I wrote the second edition of the book. It's changed again since I wrote the second edition of the book. But again, it's not just my palate sort of changing and increasing in experience, but I think wines are changing all the time as well. Not least due to climate change, but because people are choosing very carefully to make different styles of wine. You know, when I started tasting wine in 2009, no one knew what natural wine was. And now, you know, if you don't have an awareness of what that style, how it can behave in the glass, then you're kind of, you know, out of date. So it's always a continuing quest to keep up. But yeah, my inspiration is longer term. So when I was at Cambridge, there was two societies. The one I just mentioned, the Wine Society, but then we also had a student society of blind tasting. And this was just for the very sort of enthusiastic members of the Wine Society. And we really existed, that blind tasting society exists to create a team to compete in the blind tasting match, which happens every year against the University of Oxford. So Cambridge Oxford blind tasting match, it's sponsored by Paul Roger. And I participated in that match in 2011. For many years, Oxford had been winning, but we had a very good team that year, and fortunately, we won that year. The year I was in the team, but it was a very hard tasting. I remember Jancis Robinson wrote it up in the Financial Times and called it the hardest blind tasting ever, and the wines were very obscure and difficult, and the scores were quite low. But even still, I wasn't really satisfied with my performance that day. I was kind of frustrated that I missed some obvious things. And so for years, that kind of drove me to become a better taster. I do think there are some people who are naturally born very, very good tasters, but they're very, very small in number. The rest of us just have to work hard at it. And I wouldn't even say that I'm a good taster now, but I think a lot about it very analytically. And I think one of the things that I try and do is be aware of potential hazards in tastings, things that can trip you up. Have those in the back of my mind. And again, like you said, be humble in the face of what you're confronting. You know, to give you an example, I just came back from 10 days in Bordeaux tasting the En Primeur 2022 vintage. And it's a very complicated, you know, vintage to understand and to taste. And you know, the nature of the wine business is that we have to kind of rush to judgment in a way about those wines because they're going on sale immediately. So people need to know, you know, what to buy and what's recommended. So I understand why, but it's very, very hard to taste barrel samples especially in a hot, concentrated year like that. And that's an occasion when you have to be very aware of your biases, of your prejudices. It's not really possible to taste blind doing en primeur, so you know what you're tasting, but you also need to know what you're tasting in order to anticipate how the wine's going to develop, how it's going to age, what the likely trajectory of the wine is in the future. So all that's just experience, but it's also always a reminder that we can only say so much.
Maybe now about the book a little bit. Can you tell us briefly how you found the right way to conscious blind tasting, so the structure-driven way?
Yeah, so for people not familiar with the book, I started studying for the Master of Wine back in 2015. And I came out of the WSET education track. People who come out of the Master Sommelier track will have a bit of a different experience, but in WSET we're used to writing quite descriptive analysis of the wines that are in front of us. And in fact, I think WSET requires that you name a certain number of aromas and flavors that you experience in the glass. And so that was all fine. But I was, you can train yourself to be quite good at that. And, like everyone else, I passed diploma, so I must have done whatever was necessary. But in the end, I thought that it wasn't really helping me to identify wines in blind tastings, this emphasis on aromas and flavors. For the simple reason that many wines could taste like many other wines. I don't like the word neutral, but say not very aromatic styles of white wines. Many could be confused for each other from within Europe, say, or, rich, full-bodied red wines. You could have a Syrah, a Cabernet, even maybe a Grenache blend, and still be in a state of confusion if you just depend on flavors to distinguish between them. So I was frustrated in my Master of Wine Studies that, I was meant to be studying for this top qualification in the wine world, and yet I still couldn't identify between these very basic wine styles using flavors. So then what I decided to do is I decided to concentrate on the structure of wines instead. So this is quite sort of a technical, very sort of abstract and quite a dry way of tasting. But what I really realized is that I think everyone in the wine world has always known that tannins in different red varieties behave differently. Cabernet tannins feel very different from Pinot Noir tannins. That's kind of obvious. So what I did in red wines is I began to notice that we can specify variety by variety, the type or the texture of the tannins, and perhaps the level of the tannins as well. And then we can also, in red wines, identify where physically in your mouth you really feel those tannins most strongly. This is a sort of, a surprising aspect, I think, of the tannin conversation, because most people think that you just feel tannins all over your mouth, and for the most part that's true. But my idea is that all major red varieties, you can feel the tannins in a more specific place in your mouth than just saying all over. So that was sort of an important moment. So for red wines, then I had this, this trio of things to look at: the level of tannins, which of course can, vary a little bit by climate and winemaking style; the type or the texture of tannins, whether it was grainy or velvety or smooth; and then the location of the tannins in your mouth. And then combining those three things, my idea was that every major variety has got a distinctive trio of these aspects. So if you can pin them down for each wine that you're tasting, and you know what the profile of each major variety is, you should be in a much better position to understand what that variety might be in the glass. So in a way, the tannin stuff was sort of pre-prepared for me, because I think many people in wine have always been familiar with this idea that tannins are different variety by variety, but I just expanded that idea and tried to make it into a bit more of a schema. Mm-hmm. But I think what was a bit more difficult was white wines. No tannins really. So what do you do? So I just heard one of my other Master of Wine colleagues one day talk about acid structure in white wines. And I never really heard that phrase before, but it really stuck with me. And I began to think about what that would look like. So then I came up with the same idea of three components to acidity that make up acid structure. And every major variety would have a slightly different acid structure. So if you could identify these three things, variety by variety, again, you'd be in the same place. You might have a better chance of identifying your white variety. And so for white wines, that would be the level of the acidity. So, Riesling naturally would have high acidity compared to, say, Pinot Gris or Gewürztraminer. And then the next aspect would be, again, a bit like tannins, the type or the quality of the acidity. That we often think about acidity as being tart or refreshing, but can we be more specific than that? Bracing or powerful or reverberant, or try and find a word that more accurately gets to the heart of how the acidity feels in your mouth, the way it behaves. So I think that was all okay, but then I really had to introduce quite an abstract concept for the final part for white wines, which was what I called the shape of the acidity. What the shape of acidity is really about the perception of the acidity during the time the wine spends on your palate. So I always like to keep wine in my mouth for 4 or 5 seconds to taste it, get everything out of it. And during that time, my idea is that if you're attentive, you'll experience the acidity doing different things at different moments during that period. So at some moments, the acidity you'll perceive it to be higher, at other moments lower. Perhaps you'll experience it to be in different places in your mouth at different times. Perhaps it's got a sense of movement, perhaps it's static. And so all of these ideas, I try to sort of encapsulate in one image or metaphor for each major white variety. So let me give you an example to make this a bit clearer. Probably the most famous one is Chardonnay. Chardonnay has got what I call linear acidity. It's like a line. It goes from beginning to end. So when you're tasting the wine's on your palate, you feel the acidity of Chardonnay at the beginning, and it stays steady throughout from beginning to end. There's no peaks and troughs. It's at the same intensity. And all the other elements of the wine, the fruit, the oak, are sort of built around that straight line of acidity right through the core of the wine. So that's linear acidity of Chardonnay, like a line, is an absolute hallmark of the variety. So in Champagne, Blanc de Blanc Champagne, you see it. You get it in Pouligny Montrachet and Chablis. You also get it in Napa and Australia. So it's irrespective of the region or even the wine style. You see the same acid shape. So again, white wines, just summing up, white wines level, type or feel of the acidity, and finally the shape of the acidity. So with those 3 aspects, I tried to propose this idea that using those 3, you could get really close to what the variety might be without any reliance on flavor.
Because you also come out of this WSET system, basically. So we don't really have to describe the acidity. It's a new idea from you, because we always have to just identify the level of it. And we have 5 descriptors, low to high. And this kind of shape of the acidity it's kind of a new idea, but I think it could be very tricky in the beginning. So I also do blind tasting for our guests in the hotel. And I bought actually Riesling Smaragd from Wachau. That's actually father and son who are making the wines, and it's completely different style because the son is harvesting 3 weeks earlier than the father. So it's no botrytis, higher levels of alcohol, not as texture rich, so to say, not extra rich, not oily. I would guess that the shape of the acidity is still the same because it's the same variety and almost the same village, but because of perception of acidity and because of the level of acidity is so different, and also the other textural elements of the wines are so different. My question is twofold, actually. Do you think that your perception of the shape of the acidity is representative to the general public? And the second one is, do you think that the varieties only have one singular acid shape?
The second one is easier. Yeah, my whole proposal is that varieties have one acid shape in white wines. If that is not correct, then my proposal is incorrect, and you can ignore everything that I say in the book about white wines. That's really, I stand by that, and the acid shape is clearly very important. The only qualification I'd give to that is that, and I mentioned this in the book, is that the most planted worldwide varieties, the Chardonnays, the Rieslings, the Sauvignons, seem to have the strongest, clearest, most obvious acid shape. And I thought for a long time, oh, well, that's kind of convenient. That's useful for my purposes. It makes it easier for me to write about the wines. But in reality, I think that's the wrong way around. I think that they are great, noble varieties precisely because they've got a very clearly defined acid structure. So I don't know, like if you want to start talking about Grenache Blanc, or I don't know, other varieties, lesser known varieties from Croatia or the Balkans or somewhere, uh, I don't know whether those varieties have got such a strong acid profile as the famous ones I just mentioned. But I think for most of the world of wine, we are working with these famous varieties, which do clearly have a defined acid shape, which my argument is does not change irrespective of wine style or climate. For the first part of your question, yeah, clearly the concept of acid shape is the most difficult and abstract thing I propose. In the second edition of the book, I have an illustration for every white variety, which is an attempt of mine. Not that I did the illustrations; I commissioned someone to do the illustrations, to give a visual representation of my ideas. And I wanted to do that because I thought that some people might be as much visual learners as they would be learners, who understand by reading. And so I'm trying to give you two different ways to kind of wrap your head around the ideas, which are very abstract. So I like to work in words, but I also, sort of appreciate the illustrations because I think that it can help and they can add an extra dimension. But the illustrations are clearly a concession on my part that the ideas that we're working with are quite abstract. So I know that some people really appreciate the illustrations. Some people just don't kind of understand or get anything out of them, and I think that's fine. But it's certainly an admission on my part that these are quite complicated ideas. And if you've only ever been tasting for flavor, understanding acid shape is clearly the most difficult thing to sort of to change in your approach to tasting.
Maybe also to talk about the confusions sections, because I think it's also a new kind of section in the book, right? It's also a major update to the new edition. So one major and very useful update, almost for every variety, is you write these kind of small sections, because you write about Montepulciano, so that's the confusion section. Montepulciano di Abruzzo is most readily confused with Chianti, particularly because of its dusty, sandy texture. But Montepulciano shows a deeper color, greater fruit ripeness, and more mid-palate concentration than Chianti usually does, albeit not at the level of Brunello. Sangiovese also shows a greater and usually more attractive perfume. The generous fruit can suggest Valpolicella, but Montepulciano shows more tannin and is drier wine overall. Barbera is darker fruited than Montepulciano. So what was the motivational aspect, and what was the motivation behind this section, and how easy or difficult it was to write these comparisons so clearly and so bluntly? So you really compare it basically aromatically also to other varieties, but also structurally, and you really find 2-3 good examples almost to every varieties to compare them with.
So I think overall, perhaps some of your listeners have got the first edition of the book. They may not have the second edition. The second edition was published in September last year, September 2022. And it's the second edition of the book, but it's also the last edition. I've worked hard, for 5 years thinking about all this stuff to do with wine tasting by structure, and it's been fun and I've enjoyed it, but it's time for me to do other things in my life. So the second edition is the final edition. And knowing that in the back of my mind, I really wanted to try and include everything that I could think of that would be useful to wine students. So that's the overall context. The confusion section, it just means grape varieties that you can confuse for one another. And the reason why I wanted to include that, I think, is that it's a very practical help for students. Really, if you're sitting there with your tasting group discussing why isn't this, or in Italian wine, the classic confusion between Sangiovese and Nebbiolo, for instance. I just wanted to. I think there are aspects of every wine that can be summarized clearly and succinctly, quickly. Just get to the point. Why are these things different? There's only so many components to wine, aren't there, really? I mean, there's the fruit and the quality of the fruit, there's tannins, there's acidity, body, alcohol. So within this sort of limited sphere of things that can change, all you have to do really is put your finger on that one thing or two things that distinguish variety by variety. So I have so many people, I know so many students and tasters that just throw up their hands and they just give up about a variety like Gruner Veltliner, for instance. They're just like, I just don't understand it. It's impossible to get Gruner. Every time I think it's Albarino or something like that. And just say, no, what are the specific characteristics of Gruner that makes it Gruner? And then this is the kind of philosophical dimension of my project. The book clearly is very successful among wine students and like you, and that makes sense, and I'm happy for it to be so. But more broadly speaking, I think the second edition does a better job with this. I'm really trying to not just, excuse me, describe varieties. I'm trying to understand them, what makes them tick. We often think of, without really verbalizing or articulating it, we think about our friends, our family, the people closest to us. What is their personality or character? What is their motivations in life? What makes them the people that they are? What are the key components that you could sum up in just a couple of sentences that would help a stranger understand what this person is going to be like when you meet them? It's exactly the same with varieties. Philosophically, I'm trying to get to the heart of the variety. So one big change in the second edition is that while I keep on focusing on the tannins and the acid, the structural components of the variety, I start talking about a lot of other aspects of the wine as well. Like, for instance, in those Italian examples you just read, the quality of the fruit, the texture of the fruit, the body weight, all these other aspects, which give us a more complete picture of the wine rather than just talking about structure.
Yeah, I think it's a very useful one, and also you bring very diverse examples, I would say. So you compare sparkling wines, for example, or sweet wines, and you really dial it down to the core. So that's what I like about this book. It's much longer than the first one, but still it's so compressed and it's so blunt and so clearly defined, like kind of a Twitter tweet. Actually, it's very, very compressed and very, very well made. So thank you very much. This section, I think it's a major update. Maybe now some other more practical questions, because I found particularly unique and interesting in the book. In the mellow section, you talk about the two texture situation. Basically a contradiction between the texture of the fruit and the texture of the tannin. Can you explain it to us, and how can one separate the two more consistently?
I think that this idea is one that is sort of everyone understands, but I've just put a name to it. I've given it a name, and therefore I'm trying to kind of bring it into the conversation a bit more, because it's so obvious and yet we never talk about it. The fact that in red wines, fruit can have one type of texture and tannins can have a different type of texture. We just automatically assume that there's one texture to a wine. People say, oh, this wine's got a beautiful texture. Okay. And so in an example like Pinot Noir, that would usually be correct. One of the absolute genius characteristics of Pinot Noir is a continuity of texture between the fruit and the tannins. The fruit is silky and velvety, and the tannins are silky and velvety. So people often call Pinot Noir a seductive variety. And this is sort of one of the reasons why, I think, because everything there's no hard edges, there's no breaks in the texture. Everything is just a complete whole. It's a very harmonious style of wine. But let's take another example. Merlot, you mentioned Merlot. Merlot is a good example of the two textures thing. So Merlot is unlike, my argument is that it's unlike Pinot Noir. In many cases, Merlot has got one type of texture for the tannins and another type of texture for the fruit. So what is the fruit of Merlot? The fruit of Merlot, as we all know, should be the most velvety, rich, plush, ripe style of fruit among, many, maybe among all the wine grapes. It's very associated with this rich texture. But take, for instance, in Bordeaux, especially in slightly cooler years, but in moderate years as well, being a Bordeaux variety, there's always a slight graininess to the tannins. Bordeaux varieties always have got this kind of grainy quality to the tannins. And so then you're contrasting the graininess of the tannins with the velvetiness of the fruit. One of the reasons why we age, great right bank Bordeaux is because with time, the grain softens as the tannins polymerize, and then those two textures get closer to becoming one again, right? So the tannins soften and they begin to take on a bit more of the character of the fruit and being very soft and very velvety. But to begin with, when the wine is young, that's when you experience the two textures. You can see it in Nebbiolo would be another good example, right? The very kind of grainy, sandy tannins, very fine grained tannins of Nebbiolo. But Nebbiolo's got the most silky fruits you can imagine, so it's, and I don't think that these things are just kind of incidental. I think, again, these are part of the personality of these varieties, and that this kind of distinction in the two textures is part of the drama of the wine. It explains why we find these varieties so exciting. In the case of Nebbiolo, for instance, Nebbiolo is a complete wine of contrasts, isn't it? It's got these very high-toned, perfumed notes, but it's also very earthy. It's got this very lifted characteristics, but it's got very powerful tannins. So Nebbiolo is in this permanent tug of war between wanting to aspire to the heavens, but also being very grounded in the earth. And it's this dynamic, this tension, this paradox, which courses through the wine, which I think makes Nebbiolo such a fascinating variety for so many of us. Pinot is a brilliant variety for a completely different reason, because of that complete harmony of the textures. But I think so. Ideas like this are interesting for students and when they're trying to identify wines, absolutely. But I think also they help us once more to try and get to the heart of the variety and what makes each variety distinct.
And in terms of tannin, how does oak come into picture?
I was actually thinking about this last night. Someone poured me some Rioja last night, and Rioja is a wine, of course, with a lot of oak, and that wine had a lot of oak tannins. So oak tannins are really felt on the gums, and they have this obvious, but this very woody, grainy quality to them. Fruit tannins from the grapes, while they might have all the kind of textures that I describe in the book, all different kinds of textures, they're nonetheless fruit tannins. There's still some kind of element of fruitiness to them. But oak tannins can be a little bit coarse, a bit dry, just a bit aggressive. And, that's a good reason to allow a wine to age. In reality, I think winemakers are getting better. And I think that if you can taste oak tannins, today for a wine that's on the shelf, ready to drink, I don't think that's a positive. I don't think anyone wants that anymore. Oak tannins are not very sophisticated things. So you feel them on the gums, and they integrate into the wine with bottle age. But one of the interesting aspects about the location of oak tannins is that some wines have a similar location in terms of their fruit tannins. So the grape tannins and the oak tannins are felt in the same place on the gums. And those varieties are the Bordeaux varieties, always wherever they're grown in the world. So Cab, Merlot, even Cab Franc, Malbec, and then Italian varieties as well. So I remember, it's a stupid anecdote, but I was in a taxi in Saint-Emilion once, and I was talking to the taxi driver about wine, and he said that the wines of Bordeaux, he said in French, the wines of Bordeaux are de la terre et du bois, meaning they're of the earth and they're of wood. So to him, a fundamental characteristic of Bordeaux wines is that they are aged in oak. And then if you think about it, in this sense, oak tannins are located in the same place as fruit tannins are in Bordeaux varieties. So it's really a very, very natural blend. You don't always perceive oak tannins very strongly in Bordeaux varieties, wherever they're grown in the world. I think simply because they all get kind of wrapped up, texturally speaking, with the fruit tannins, which are felt in the same location. So I think that's good, and it makes sense why Bordeaux should be a wine of wood, as the taxi driver said. But then there are other varieties where I think you have to be a little bit careful. take, for instance, Pinot. Pinot, the tannins are felt on the tongue, and then they sort of move up to the upper part of the mouth. They're not really on the gums. So if you have new oak on a Pinot, then you risk creating this tannin structure around the edge of the mouth when the rest of the wine is in the middle. And so you can have a bit of a contrast there. And again, with enough bottle age, everything integrates. But if you're trying to produce wines which are balanced immediately for immediate consumption, that's the kind of thing that you might want to think about.
I think we had a kind of similar idea, or I have a similar idea as a sommelier, but I also have to maybe explain it a bit differently. And I try to explain wines to our guests like basically as a Ferrari wine, which is very linear, very like kind of quick in the mouth, or like an SUV, which is kind of broad, like a Chardonnay with mellow, and And would you say that it is kind of the same idea as the shape of the acidity? So basically the structure, what we use for structure, and the shape of the acidity in white wines are basically the similar thing?
Yeah, so this really touches on an idea which I present in the second edition of the book, which is called construction. I call it construction. And so what it does is it takes structure, but it integrates it with the other components of the wine. So I talked about, let's go back to our Chardonnay example. I talked about the linearity of the acidity in Chardonnay, but clearly the mouthfeel of a Champagne Blanc de Blanc is extremely different from a California Chardonnay. That's because of climate. Different climates are going to give different body weights, richness of fruit, concentration, alcohol, all that kind of thing. So what I'm really interested in is the way that these elements interact. So, for instance, in a warmer climate example, Puy-Fouissé or California or wherever it makes warm climate, moderate to warm climate Chardonnay, then the acidity may be of a slightly lower level. That's natural in that kind of environment. But in a way, it plays an even more important job than it does in a cool climate, because you have more, as the French say, matière, substance of the wine, more weight, more density of fruit to propel along, because that's the job of acidity in Chardonnay, to move the rest of the wine forward, to drag it along from beginning to the end of the time on the palate. So even those rich wines, even buttery Chardonnays and things like that from California, still have that sense of movement. And I think that's a kind of unsung hero aspect of Chardonnay that people should think about. By contrast, take Champagne. Champagne, say Blanc de Blanc Champagne, obviously doesn't have the burden of fruit to carry along with it. It's much lighter on the palate. But what's the purpose of the Chardonnay here? Really, it's for structural reasons. It is the skeleton of the wine. Acid structure, tannin structure are always the skeleton of a wine, but it's very naked in a wine like Blanc de Blanc Champagne. The acidity is this straight rail, and it just propels the wine forward with such a sense of energy and movement. Why do you want energy and movement in Champagne? Because that's the whole point of Champagne, to be a bright, lively, energetic wine. It goes hand in hand with the bubbles. Because of the power of that acid structure in Blanc de Blanc Champagne, often those wines can be quite long aging as well. The only thing I would add, finally, to that discussion is that Chardonnay and Champagne doesn't always have very generous mid-palate fruit. Fruit always lives on the tongue in the middle of the palate, and that's why I call it mid-palate fruit. And so for wines which are perhaps made for a bit more immediate consumption, you may want to consider doing something to your wine to add a bit more mid-palate texture, a bit more body, a bit more richness. Otherwise, you can have a slightly austere expression just of structure, just of acidity in Blanc de Blanc Champagne. And so you can do a variety of things. You can add in, reserve wine, perhaps, which will have a bit more autolytic character. You can, of course, you can blend with a little bit of Pinot Noir or Pinot Meunier, which adds fruitiness in the middle. And you can, perhaps increase your dosage. Sugar always adds a bit of, of body and of texture. And so all of these things are basically a statement saying, Chardonnay is fantastic for its amazing, firm, linear acidity, but sometimes it can suffer a little bit from a lack of mid-palate. And depending on the wine style I'm trying to make, that could be something I might want to try and correct in some way.
And now maybe the holiest, or maybe the unholiest term of all is minerality. So you also use this term in the book multiple times, even with red wines quite often. For example, with Gevrey, Chambertin in Burgundy. I think minerality is also somehow related to the shape of acidity or the structure of the wine, in like how I perceive it, basically, because we all know from Alex Maltman that minerals don't transfer to wine directly. So it's kind of a perception, basically, or at least for me, that the wine ends narrowly, and it has like a slightly salty, clear edginess to it, so to say. So what's your idea, maybe, about minerality, and how often do you use it?
Well, how long have you got? It's a very complicated discussion, isn't it? And it's a very fraught discussion right now. But I think, and this is not something in the book, this is not something I've written an article about, and it's not, frankly, something that anyone in the wine world is talking about. But I think that we are looking and observing something in the wine world, especially right now in the context of these warm years in the 2020s, that is happening right in front of our eyes, and no one's given it a name and no one's talking about it, but it's absolutely fundamental to modern winemaking, especially in Europe. And this is a concept called sapidity. I mentioned this in passing in the book. I don't talk about it a lot, but it kind of gets in there a little bit. What is sapidity? Sapidity is the taste of something savory in wine, especially in white wine. In red wine, there's a lot of savory components, which are called tannins. Tannins are dry, savory components, so that's fine. But in white wine, you have fruit. It's kind of like a seesaw, like a children's seesaw. On one end of the seesaw, you have fruit. Fruit is fruity, meaning that it's always got some kind of vaguely sweet taste to it. Of course, wines from warmer climates will taste a bit sweeter than wines from cooler climates. But basically, fruit always tastes fruity. It's always a little bit sweet. So you have on the one side of the seesaw fruit, which is a bit sweet. And on the other side, you have all the other elements of a wine which balance out the sweetness or the fruitiness. Why would you need that? Because fruitiness by itself is one, cloying, but two, and perhaps more importantly, it's boring. If we just want to drink fruit, we can drink fruit juice. Wine is more interesting than fruit juice because it's not one thing, it's not one note, it's more complex than that. So what are the things that balance out fruit and that add complexity to it? White wines, acidity, very obvious. That's the most obvious one. Acidity is sour. So immediately you have some balancing out of the fruitiness of the fruit, the sweetness of the fruit. What other elements can we put in there? A huge one, which I talk about quite a lot in the second edition, and again, this is another subject which no one ever talks about, but which is super important, is phenolics in white wine. Phenolic content. Some people call it by the old-fashioned name dry extract. What it means is the solid components in white wines. So almost like the tannins in white wines that can often come from the grape skins. So any amount of skin contact prior to fermentation will contribute to that sensation. Even firm pressing will contribute to that. Using different parts of the press cycle, perhaps the later parts which are pressed a bit harder, things like that will contribute. So anyway, so what the sensation of phenolics is in the mouth is a drying sensation, just like tannins dry out your mouth in red wines, right? So phenolics are generally felt around the gums and on the finish of the wine. So that contributes a drying sensation. Phenolics also give a little bit of bite, a little bit of attack, which means freshness, actually. And so again, we have another balance here for the fruitiness, the sweetness of the fruit. You have bite, attack, freshness, perhaps even a little bit of bitterness on the finish from phenolics. If you think about wines, a lot of Italian white wines, Soave would be one, but go to Alsace, always you get a little bit of bitterness on the finish. Why would you want that in Alsace? Because you have so much fruit in wines like the Gewürztraminer, Pinot Gris. Okay, so on one side we have fruit, on the other side we have acidity and phenolics. Salinity is saltiness, some kind of salty character to the wines. Wines like Muscadet, Albarino, other Portuguese, Spanish whites, Assyrtiko. Wines like this, they have some kind of salty component. Again, we can argue about where that comes from, but it's a recognizable and consistent feature of those kind of wines, even Chablis. So salt, of course, is dry, So it's another thing to be put on the side of the ledger, along with the acidity and the phenolics. Wine making. How can wine making change this kind of profile? Well, I think, again, if you've got a very fruity wine like a Chardonnay, plenty generous, ripe fruit, warm vintage every year in Burgundy, to give one example, there's always a warm vintage these days. So you've got no shortage of fruit in these classic European regions of origin. So again, you might want to, and perhaps you haven't got very much acidity. So again, you might want other sources of savoriness, of sapidity in your white wines. And winemaking is one way you can do it. I'll give you two things from winemaking you can do. The use of lees. Lees gives texture, yes, but it also gives a more savory taste profile. It's kind of not really earthy, but this sort of this quite dry sensation that lees give. And the second thing is, we'll talk about Chardonnay. Mostly you see this with Chardonnay, but some other varieties as well, and some red varieties, is reduction. So reduction, for people who are not familiar, is simply reducing the amount of oxygen a wine is exposed to, which can give us kind of tighter profile on the palate, makes the wine a bit tighter, more focused. And it can result in these kind of sulfurous aromas, these kind of smoky, struck match, flinty aromas on the wine. And again, just think about all the notes I just gave. They're all savory. They're all dry. So reduction and lees are two components of winemaking, which would also go on the side of the savory, the dry, the sapid, on the other side of the seesaw from the fruit. So you can see we're building up this list of elements that a winemaker can use to help balance out this ripe fruit he's getting from these increasingly warm vintage, especially in Europe. But this is 10 minutes to get back to your original question. This is how I perceive minerality, as being part of the dry elements in a wine, which help balance out the fruit. And so I think you were quite right in the way that you described it, as saying something which gives a bit more focus or dryness to the wine, especially perhaps on the finish. So you think about different types of minerality. Perhaps you have some kind of smokiness in volcanic wines like Assyrtiko or Soave. Perhaps you have some kind of oyster shell saltiness, or even something darker in some parts of Chablis. You have that kind of resin thing in Puligny-Montrachet. All of these elements of minerality, again, of course, they're all savory again. So if you are blessed with a terroir that can naturally give you that, then already you're kind of winning in this kind of dry, sweet seesaw puzzle, because that element comes natively, so it's one less thing for you to worry about. But overall, I think that we should conceive of minerality only within this broader context of sapidity. I think, for instance, a lot of people confuse, say, phenolics for minerality. It's not just because it's dry, it doesn't make it mineral, So, but my argument is that minerality is one of the contributors to sapidity, which is this much broader category, and one which is, I think, vital for understanding the way that people are making white wines today, especially in ever warming climates.
When you write about varieties and countries, do you think that you manage to stay impartial? What I mean is that could you, or even can you, in your everyday life, judge a wine's or a grape's quality objectively?
Probably not. And I don't think any of us believe anymore, do we, in this concept of like this sort of encyclopedia style writing, where there is sort of objective truth out there, untainted by any human contact. It doesn't really work like that, and that's why I'm happy to talk with you. I'm on Instagram, and people send me messages, and I reply with when they have questions about the book. I'm not a hidden author. I'm out here. I'm just I'm just it's just like I said at the beginning. It's this kind of proposal for a way of tasting. I think people in reviews have complained that I don't seem to like their favorite variety or whatever. Look, I do like varieties with rigorous structures, which are clearly defined, and wines with some kind of intellectual interest, like I was talking about the Nebbiolo and the way that there's all this dynamic sort of movement at the heart of that kind of wine. I do find those varieties more interesting, but it's not. I would say in my defense, I don't think that's just me. I think all I'm doing is, baptizing worldly tastes. I think the rest of the world is more or less, with me, because these are the major varieties that we see having such commercial success around the world. So, no, I'm not impartial, but my system does require me to present a sort of analytical framework for all varieties, irrespective of what I might think about them and whether I drink them.
I would be the last who judges you because I'm nearly not so impartial as you were in the book. So also about the producer recommendations, because that was one reason I wanted to talk about objectivity or subjectivity, because you also added producer recommendations. Maybe one important questions for a student, or maybe for other wine enthusiasts who just want to read a book and maybe have another aspect to learn about varieties, is that are they your personal recommendations, your personal favorites, or they represent the more typical examples for someone who wants to be well prepared for an exam?
Yeah, so I have three categories which the producers must fulfill in order to be listed. One is that absolutely the wines must be typical. Typical is a very difficult philosophical concept to defend, but let's just leave that for the aside for one moment. So they must be typical. They must give a good example, a classic example, which will be helpful to people preparing for exams, but also for I work with collectors who just say, Nick, what I don't understand, what's this wine region all about? What is this variety all about? This is the kind of wine that I could give them and they would understand. Okay, so typical. Two, that they must be relatively widely available across the world. People read my book everywhere in the world, and so there's no point working with people who only sell at the cellar door in an obscure region. So some international presence. And thirdly, that the wines should be at least relatively affordable. That's a moving concept when it comes to regions like Burgundy, of course, but I don't see any value in saying producer recommendation Burgundy, DRC, Rousseau, Meunier, wines that most normal people cannot afford anymore. So it's not a question about who the best producers are, but producers that you and I might be able to afford and find and produce typical examples.
And you already mentioned that you work with basically collectors now.
Yes, that's one part of the many different things I do. I work with collectors. I also import wine into Florida here, where I am, and sell to restaurants and retailers here in Florida, and yeah, a bunch of different projects.
Okay, so how are your days look like today? Because you're also a master wine since
2019.
2019. So how are your days look like nowadays? What are the different projects that you take on?
Well, I used to work for a big company, for Sotheby's, for 8 years. So I worked in London, New York, and I commuted in and sat behind my desk, and it was great, and I learned so much, and so grateful for my experience there. But yeah, I have a very different life now. I decided to try and work for myself. And like many masters of wine, I do different projects. and I sort of combine them to earn a living. Yeah, I work with private clients managing their collections, in terms of fine wine. And so I look out for wines for them to buy, and I manage all their inventory, and I tell them what to drink, and just practical things like I ensure that the wines get delivered to their house or wherever it needs to be, things like that, so they don't have to worry about anything. And then I spend a lot of time now on my importing business, which is new as of last year. So I have about 7, 8, 9 producers I work with from Europe, from all different countries in Europe, and I sell them to the best restaurants and retailers in Florida. So I have some sales reps who sell my wines, but I also like to have relationships with the accounts as well. So I spend a lot of time on the road in my car and with my samples in my bag, going around and meeting the accounts and trying to sell the wines and promote the wines. So that still takes up a big part of my day. And then just typical things, running that business, paying the bills, managing the shipping, managing the accounts, all that kind of stuff, typical of any kind of business. And then I do more, stuff on the education side. So, book related stuff, but I still work with Master of Wine students as a mentor. So I try and help them. They send me, mock exams to mark and things like that. And I try and help out with this student group in Miami, which is near where I am. And this weekend I will go down there and prepare a mock exam for them and things like that. So yeah, it's very, very diverse what I do. No 2 days are alike, but I enjoy it like that.
Which aspect do you enjoy the most?
Well, I think the one that really gets me out of bed right now is the importing. And mostly I work with producers that are not well known yet, but they're small family producers making fantastic quality wines. So and what I always say is I've got the right wines at the right prices. It's just about getting them in front of people, and it's just an exciting challenge, any inventory business, like as a sommelier, you have to be able to justify why everything is you've paid for it, you own the inventory, why it's sitting there, how are you gonna sell it, what the strategy is. But yeah, I mean, I sell to numerous, Michelin star restaurants and the best places across the state, and it's very exciting. It's very exciting to present these new wines and have them, trust me and trust my palate and recognize that their guests could like these producers. And so yeah, I'm very excited about that project right now.
And how vibrant, how often is the market in Florida? I mean, is it still the mostly the classical regions which are in the wine list, or what are the hottest new topics there in Florida, if there are any?
Well, you have to understand a little bit of recent history to understand the Florida market. So when COVID started in 2020, as you know, as in every other country, almost all the restaurants were shut down, often for a long time. But in America, it was decided on a state-by-state basis. So in Florida, we didn't really shut down the restaurants here. They were shut down for 1 month. I think it was April 2020. And then all restaurants were allowed to operate normally if they wanted to. So that really meant that Florida was one of the only places in the entire country where people could go out for dinner. And that was a huge difference to, for people in other states. So a lot of people wanted to experience a bit more relaxed lifestyle. So they came to Florida, some just for a little bit, some moved house and moved from other states and moved here permanently. And not just people, but also businesses. And so a lot of top restaurants in New York decided to open in Miami, for instance. They couldn't do any business in New York, so they thought, well, let's try something different. And so, of course, all those businesses have stayed since 2020, and they're still going strong. And in addition, they brought new sommeliers to Florida. So young people, often from New York or San Francisco or Seattle, the more traditional markets for fine wine. And so what you had, before all this was a relatively conservative market here, selling mostly, Super Tuscans and Napa Cabs and some Bordeaux and Champagne. But now these new restaurants, these young sommeliers are really looking for more diverse wines. And so that's the kind of, market need that I'm trying to fill. Fresh, vibrant, aromatic wines from Europe, which are perfectly suited to the warm climate we have here in Florida, but haven't traditionally been on wine lists. So that's the challenge, but also the opportunity.
Oh, sounds like something to work on, basically, because if you have a very conservative market, which we also have in Tyrol now in Austria, and I think most wine drinkers, especially in the age above 60, I would say, they drink the same stuff since they were 20. So I think it's also very challenging, but also very exciting time in the wine world, also here in the old world, so to say. So I think in Austria, and as wines from other, even Eastern European countries have evolved, and also German wine have evolved in the past, I think the European wine landscape has also been a bit more interesting and a bit more diverse. And also as Burgundies became uh, almost unaffordable, basically, for the average person, as you already mentioned, I think it's getting more colorful almost every year. Do you see any new or emerging wine regions in the world, or maybe in Europe, what you maybe put more focus on?
I like you said, I honestly think this is we're living in the greatest ever time to drink wine. I think my interest is really a bit more European wine. So I think there are very exciting things happening outside of Europe. South Africa is really an unbelievably interesting country right now. Places like New Zealand diversifying their wine styles. Even things like Malbec from Argentina are now available in such a wide range of styles that, there's something for everyone. So all sorts of interesting things happening in those places. But in Europe, I think there's two things going on. One, there's new regions being either discovered for the first time or rediscovered. I'm thinking about, of course, my native England, which is now producing really outstanding world-class sparkling wines. I left England in 2012, and there was really nothing to speak of at that time. That's how quickly that industry has developed. Or a region like Vinho Verde, for instance, in Portugal, which frankly has not got a very good reputation for making serious wines. But again, a new generation of winemakers are saying, no, we've got unbelievable granite soils, a great, warm climate during the day, cold at night, and a fantastic variety in Alvarinho. So you get these single variety Alvarinhos, one of which I import, and they're so concentrated, mineral, serious wines, just a world away from the kind of low alcohol, spritzy, carbonated styles of the past. So, I think that's one aspect, new regions. But then I'd also point out the importance of recognizing new styles in classic regions. You already mentioned a really good example about a region like the Pajau, so associated with these very rich Baroque, often botrytis styles of high alcohol, very kind of oily. The truth is, I don't think that that's where consumers' palates are today. And I think that clarity, precision, detail, purity are more attractive to drinkers right now. So it doesn't surprise me at all to hear your example about people kind of moving that direction with the new generation. Or take Barolo, for instance. 10 years ago, and even, some old textbooks still talk about this, don't touch Barolo for 10 years, at least 15 years. If you still think that, you haven't been to Barolo recently, you haven't tasted what's coming out of these classic regions. Barolo, they've worked so hard on tannin management that most of the regular Barolos, the ones that just say Barolo on the label, are really ready to drink, from the moment they're released onto the market, which is already 4 years after the vintage, right? So, supple tannins, fragrant fruit, elegance, finesse, beautiful wines. And then I would say that the cru category, the single vineyard category, of course, those are more powerful, age-worthy styles to fulfill that traditional Barolo style. But this is a region which is kind of changing before our eyes, and for the better, I think. And again, the younger new generation is responsible for a lot of those changes.
In this relation, maybe also because of climate change and because of the generational change, do you think that blind tasting is getting more difficult?
Yes and no. I think that there can be more similarities between, say, parts of the New World and parts of Europe in terms of the ripeness. Again, I just came back from Bordeaux, where most wines this vintage were 14.5, and many, more than that. So you can't just distinguish Europe from non-European origins by doing it on ripeness or alcohol levels, for sure. But I think more than ever, though, the flip side to that is that I think producers are ever more committed to expressing two things: their variety and their place. And so anything that obscures those two things is undesirable. So, even in Bordeaux, amid these conversations about alcohol levels, then we're also talking about how this plot has become fundamental to this Grand Vin, and it's got the best gravel soils over clay to retain the water and things like that. So we're still seeking this kind of terroir expression. And the regions, I don't know, take Germany and Austria, two different winemaking countries, but they both, at present at least, seem to share to me a desire for purity and detail as a means, a vehicle for expressing their origins. So you have Wachau being different from Kremstal or Kemptal. You have the Mosel being very different from the Pfalz further south. And again, this almost sort of almost technical commitment to purity in these varieties like Riesling and Gruner, but also interestingly in Germany in Spätburgunder, to have this, rather than having sort of blousy, opulent, perhaps soft, kind of oaky wines, instead you have high acid, high aroma wines, pure and refreshing. And again, all of these things, I think, are removing obstacles away from expressing place. Let me give you one final example. Grower Champagne. Grower Champagne is, again, it's a complicated label, but let's just run with it for now. Not the big houses, but the small family producers, which own their own land. What's the whole point of Grower Champagne? Does Grower Champagne just taste like, Bollinger or Paul Roger? No, and it doesn't, because small family producers which own vines in one village or two villages can put the name of that village on the label of the wine, right? So suddenly, for the first time, this is 20 years old now, but Champagne becomes a terroir wine rather than being a huge blend across the entire region. And so you can have one variety, one village, one vintage, even one vineyard. And by the way, all the Grand Marques now have suddenly started making all these styles, having taken their cue from the smaller producers, because I think the real excitement in a region like Champagne is the ability, just like any other great wine region, to express the place.
And one last question from a fellow student and a very dear friend of mine. How often do you taste? But basically, the most important question is, which I'm also interested in, is how do you structure the tastings to take blind tasting to scale to the next level?
Well, I don't know about the next level. All I can tell you is what I did when I was preparing for the Master of Wine exam, which is I would taste maybe 12 wines together. And because I would be doing it at home by myself, I would know what the 12 wines were, but I would mix up the order. So it was, half blind. And I would taste very similar styles together. You could do, say, a southern France tasting. So you have some left bank and right bank Bordeaux, some Cahors, Madiran, Châteauneuf-du-Pape, Languedoc red blend, Côte du Rhône, Creuse Hermitage. some like big, ripe styles from the south of France. And you put them all in a tasting, and then you note down what's distinctive about each one. And then, you see whether those notes help you to identify the wine correctly.
Mm.
And then you're like, okay, so now I know the difference between Creux Hermitage and Chateauneuf du Pape. Now I know the difference between Bordeaux and Madarin, And so then you do the tasting again, and then you see whether you get them right this time, So it's finding, and you don't have to use my language, and you shouldn't use my language or any other textbook's language, but find language that works for you, which helps you to just distinguish between these different but very similar wine styles, and then use that thinking to approach the next tasting when you come across these kind of wines. So it's deliberately making the tasting hard for yourself, because only in that very difficult context, I think, do you really learn a lot.
Do you use any digital tools to record your tasting notes somewhere, or do you still use like the old-fashioned pen and paper?
No, I'm much more of a typer. So I run my whole life off Evernote, which is a note-taking app. People who don't know it, but yeah, I prefer to type. I typed the Master of Wine exam, and I like doing that. I like to be organized. The whole scheme in the book is my attempt to impose some kind of order on the chaos of tasting. Some kind of overall scheme. And I really ran a lot of my life like that, just trying to be orderly, doing things for a reason with a structure.
So cool, Nick. Thank you very much. Would you like to add something?
No, just thank you for very intelligent questions, and I'd love to get over to your part of the world, and I'll let you know the next time I'm there. Maybe we can taste some wine together.
Yeah, please let me know. I mean, the weather is a bit more cloudy than in Florida, but I'm sure that the mountains maybe do some good. So thank you very much, and have a nice day, sir.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having me.